Thanks to everyone for coming along. I'm really happy that you could all make it and very pleased and grateful. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of New Island Books. I'm Eoin Purcell, I'm editorial director, and I've worked with John for a good few years at this stage, primarily on the Irish story, but on this book as well, and it's a real pleasure to be publishing it. I'm quite delighted. I think he's one of the most modest people I've ever met. He never really blows his own trumpet, and I think it's a shame because he really is quite a talented man. He's quite an excellent writer, and he's a very impressive researcher and someone who has a very objective mindset, which I think is impressive, particularly displayed when he writes about Irish history, because as we all know, it's very easy to take sides with Irish history. I think in this book, Peace After the Final Battle, he's really captured, to my mind, what's best about his writing style and about his work in Irish history, which he's displayed throughout everything he's done for the Irish story, but it really comes to full fruition in this book, and I'm really delighted that New Island could publish it. I know that he's going to do many books after this, and I have to say that it's kind of exciting to be the publisher of his first official book, because I did work with him in ebook form, which was also exciting, but it doesn't look as impressive, I have to say, and very difficult to give as a gift, which I encourage you all to do. So publishers don't really have too much to do at these events, so I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you all again for coming, and just congratulate John and invite Brian Hanley, historian and author, to launch the book. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm very pleased. In fact, I'm delighted to be here tonight and have been asked by John and the publishers to launch his new book, Peace After the Final Battle. I first became aware of John's work through the excellent blog, The Irish Story, which he edits. I think it was around 2009. My attention was drawn to the blog because there were a series of articles on it dealing with various aspects of the Irish Revolution. And they included arguments and assessments of the revolutionary period that I hadn't really seen as clearly put elsewhere. Certainly very unusual on the wild and wonderful world of the internet to find serious historical arguments put across as clearly as John does on the Irish story. A number of articles struck me from early on. One was to do with the ideology of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the secret organisation that was key in many ways to the background and build-up of the movement that eventually struck for Irish independence. And John analysed the ideology of the IRB through its newspaper, Irish Freedom. And of course, it's from Irish Freedom that the very striking title of this book comes. The Irish attitude to England is war yesterday, war today, war tomorrow, peace after the final battle. That's from Irish Freedom in November 1910. And John wrote very well about the IRB and indeed contradictions within the IRB in the period up till 1916. But John also wrote about other aspects of the revolution, including aspects of the revolution that are sometimes ignored or sidelined in traditional history. He's written a very good article about the general strike and the fight for Irish independence. 4 different general strikes take place in Ireland between 1918 and 1922 for slightly different reasons as well. And John wrote about that, and indeed he's never been shy about looking at class and class struggle in the context of the fight for Irish independence. But another very interesting aspect of the independence struggle that John looked at on the Irish story was in an article called The Rabble and the Republic. And that article was also about class, but it was about how many of the poorest, unskilled people in Dublin and in elsewhere across Ireland reacted very angrily against the insurgents in 1916 and indeed in 1918 as well. And it's still a question I think that many historians haven't fully grappled with. Why do some of the poorest people in Irish towns in 1918 continue to support the Home Rule Party rather than Sinn Féin? And why do they actually physically fight against Sinn Féin? And John looked at some of those questions. He's also written very interesting overviews. In fact, I think some of the fairest and most balanced overviews of the question of sectarianism in the revolutionary period. John's examination of the debates around the Dunmanway killings in Cork, for example, are amongst the fairest and most balanced that you'll find written about that. And indeed, John's assessment of the legacy of the historian Peter Hart as well stand out as balanced, critical and able to, again, to draw out contradictions in both the arguments for and against the positions being put forward by historians. In a word, I think John's historical writing is extremely sophisticated. He's also written very well about the Dirty War from 1922 to 23, the Civil War as it's fought in Dublin in particular, and also in other parts of the country such as Kerry and Sligo. And again, it's a fascinating area which I hope John will return to, and I often think that the Dirty War in Dublin in particular would make a very interesting movie, let alone a documentary, as former hard men from Michael Collins' squad now become the assassins of the new Free State regime, and John has written about this as well. In Peace After the Final Battle, John knits together many of these strands into what's a very compelling narrative of the Irish Revolution. And I think, again, a strength of John's book, and he argues this very convincingly in his introduction, is that this is a book about the people, essentially. It is very largely a history from below. John hopes to show in his book that the struggle for Irish independence was indeed a popular mass movement, far beyond simply young men with guns, although for those who are interested in that, there is plenty about young men with guns in the book. But in this book, John incorporates those who marched against conscription, those who participated in general strikes, those who occupied land they believed belonged to the people, or even themselves, those who campaigned for Sinn Féin and against them, those who held torchlight parades for returning prisoners. And in it again, he argues that social and economic factors, which are often dismissed as irrelevant in some cases, were unavoidably at the heart of events as they progressed. In particular, again, he looks at the land question, which many people have ignored. And I think John is right to argue, centrally from the beginning, that British administration in Ireland before the First World War was not democratic as we understand the term today, nor was the limited autonomy known as Home Rule the same thing as Irish independence. While armed revolt wasn't inevitable, it was in large part a result of the frustrations built up during the First World War among Irish separatists. Again, John argues that the war is very important for that. While legitimate debates will continue to ask whether violence was necessary to gain a significant measure of independence, John argues the argument that the upheaval of 1916 to 23 changed nothing is, this book will argue, false. And I think John is very correct to argue that. But more than simply putting forward this argument, I think what's important is that John is writing a book about the Irish people in all their aspects. In 1912, the Irish people included Home Rulers and Republicans, Socialists and Hibernians, Feminists and Unionists, both Ulster and otherwise, and Irish Islanders. All these people were divided again by class, by religion, by divisions between the town and the country, and they also included large numbers of people who were apolitical, who fretted about where the next day's work or food would come from, people who were more concerned about their personal lives than politics, and people who disagreed vehemently with each other. And I think that comes across in John's history book. You are not dealing with cardboard characters, you're not dealing with ciphers, you're dealing with real people who change their minds from day to day based on the way that events impact on them and their families. And of course, we're also divided today in many ways. We're divided among historians and the general public about what actually occurred between 1912 and 1924, and of course we're divided on how to commemorate this. And I think that's a good thing. If there's one sense in which we're like our ancestors 100 years ago, it's that we disagree with each other about a lot of important issues. And I think debate about these things is good, and argument is generally to be welcomed. But I think argument is better if it's grounded in fact. If we are going to, over the next decade, get into huge rows with each other about what we're commemorating, it'd be good if we knew what actually happened between 1912 and 1924. And a very, very good place to start is John's compelling new book. So thank you very much, and I'll introduce you.
Who needs a publicist then? Yeah, thanks very much, Brian. There's very little I have remaining to say after that those very kind words from Brian Hanley, and hopefully I can return the favour for him someday. Brian was probably one of my greatest influences in entering this period of Irish history. So briefly, very briefly, thank you all very much for coming out today. Thank you to Eoin Purcell, who is in many ways the instigator of this project. Thank you to my family for their constant support, two of whom are at the front here. Brian already explained the title. The title is Peace After the Final Battle, is a quote from the Irish Republican Brotherhood newspaper. More broadly, it kind of encompasses the way that Irish separatist activists at the time felt that they were involved in something that was changing history forever, that this was the final battle, the final achievement of Irish freedom. Now, how much they achieved what they wanted to achieve, the book tries to talk about rather than to answer. Because even today, 100 years on, We're still grappling with some of the same problems that they faced. We're still trying to achieve some of the things they wanted to achieve. So in this question and in other questions, the book tries to provide more questions than answers. As Brian said, it tries to tell the story of the people who were involved, and to judge them as little as possible, except by how they judge themselves, if that makes sense. So just to round off, as I said, I'd be brief, I'm going to tell you about two people who pop up in the book. The first one of them is Joseph O'Connor. Joseph O'Connor was an office worker from Dublin. He was a separatist activist before the First World War, when there was very few such things. He was involved in the Irish Volunteers from the start, and the reason I bring him up is because he has a very interesting quote around the outbreak of the First World War, because the outbreak of the First World War in Ireland was preceded a week before with the Howth gun running, where the Irish Volunteers illegally imported arms in Howth, and by the Bachelor's Walk shootings, where the British Army opened fire on crowds who were jeering the British troops for having failed to stop them doing this. And Joseph O'Connor said that the First World War broke out the next week, and he said people who had been rabid separatists the week before were now waving the Union Jack, and he said he was sickened by the inconstancy of the ordinary people. And so what this kind of illustrates is, as Brian says, how chaotic and how muddled human history actually is. As matters went along, Joseph O'Connor fought in the Easter Rising of 1916. He fought in the War of Independence in Dublin. But what's most interesting of all in Joseph O'Connor's accounts of the period, especially in the Bureau of Military History, is that in the Civil War he was captured he took the anti-treaty side in the Civil War. He explained his position as the Parliament of the Irish Free State, the Dáil, had overstepped its authority by accepting the treaty, by disestablishing the republic that he fought for, and that he was caught in Dublin at his job. He was arrested by his former comrades, he was beaten in custody, he was shot at in custody during an attack on Wellington Barracks, which is now Griffith College. And after the Civil War, Joseph O'Connor left one of the most searing descriptions of what's now called post-traumatic stress disorder, where as he put it, his nerve had completely gone, to the extent that he could no longer walk to work without his wife accompanying him. And any time a car pulled up outside his house, he thought it was his enemies coming to get him, and he used to hide under the bed. So Joseph O'Connor is one character. One more character, who many more of you will have heard of, is Ernest Blythe. Ernest Blythe is mostly remembered for being a dull, grey minister in the Irish Free State. But Ernest Blythe is actually a much more interesting character, as hopefully you'll see in the book, than he's given credit for. Ernest Blythe first appears in the book writing articles arguing bizarrely for revolutionary socialism in 1910. This is true. I can give you the references for this. But Ernest Blythe was from County Down. He was a Protestant. He became a Gaelic League, first of all, activist, an Irish language activist, later a farm worker in Kerry, and after that, Irish Republican Brotherhood, Irish volunteer activist, right through from 1916 until the outbreak of Civil War, when he vehemently backed the treaty, when he became one of the first ministers in the Irish Free State, and lastly, although this is not really mentioned in the book, he became the very censorious director of the Abbey Theatre. The book is not really about high politics. It's not really about the likes of Winston Churchill or even Michael Collins. It really tries to tell the story of the ordinary people who were involved in the struggle for Irish independence, how they succeeded and how they failed. Okay, and I'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much.